Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.35, and in this lesson we're going to move on to the EQ2's big brother, which is the EQ-5. If you understand how to use the EQ2, the EQ-5 should be a complete breeze. So if you haven't watched the video on the EQ2, go to the playlist, go back one video, and you can watch that. So we're really not going to talk too much about the EQ-5, but at least I can show you what I wanted to show you in the last video, but got tripped up because I forgot that the high band there on the EQ2 didn't give us access to a low pass filter. One thing I'll mention is that both the EQ2 and the EQ5 would be considered parametric EQ, which basically means you have control over level, over frequency, and then you also have that Q width control, the bandwidth control. Again, nomenclature is not that important, but some of you may want to know that, especially because the EQ DJ is different from the EQ2 and EQ5. It's not a full-blown parametric EQ. However, nowadays, a lot of these words are all getting interchanged because EQs are becoming more and more powerful, especially in the digital domain where you can kind of get all the EQs to act in different ways. But that's just words. Let's actually take a listen and take a look at the EQ5. So here again, we have the EQ2. We've gone over all of these parameters. And now let's pull in an EQ5. If you look at the EQ5, it looks very, very similar to the EQ2, plus a few different options in here. We have our global amount, so we can actually kind of create a wet-dry mix using the EQ, which is fairly interesting. It's like parallel processing with EQ. So if we wanted to, for example, we could play the drum loop. We could use our shelf. Boost in this area. But then if we actually wanted like a 50-50 of that, we could pull it down. As compared to just a little bit more added in there subtly. The other nice feature is that we have an output control, so we can determine the volume as we move along the signal chain. And a lot of times what you'll end up having is an EQ with probably some reductive EQ, meaning we're not going to do any boost, we're only going to be doing cuts. And then we'd have a compressor followed by another EQ, which would be considered the sweetener EQ or the additive EQ. So it always makes a lot of sense to cut out unwanted frequencies, and then if you have to put into a compressor, you would do it after that fact, and then you could maybe boost a little bit more if there's some frequency range that you really like or are fond of. So we have that output control. That's super helpful. So we can usually, if we're doing additive, we'll be turning it down. If we're doing reductive, we'll be turning this up to try to match those levels. EQ is one of those fickle devices, a lot like compression, where because you're adding gain a lot of times, you always assume that you've made a very wise move, when in reality, you need to make sure you balance that gain at either that output stage or in a lot of times the input stage, so that way you can A/B it and make sure that you've actually made smart moves, not that you've just boosted volume. And we already know that if we make something louder, we're going to like it that much more. I'm not 100% sure what this shift parameter does, so I'm just going to increase a few areas here and take a listen. So we're going to learn this one together, I guess. Interesting. So when we turn this, I can get this image in here as well. So when I turn this all the way up, we seem to be getting more activity in the low end. As I turn it down, we seem to be getting a little more activity up here in the high end. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure what that does, so I would just encourage you not to really use it because I don't really see any use for it. Although creatively, it's kind of interesting because it sounds like a whole nother filter that's being applied to the entire frequency spectrum. So you could potentially automate this and do like which is kind of interesting. So do keep that in mind for when you're doing your creative projects. And let's keep in mind that when I'm going over all these effects, I'm trying to put them in a creative-based context. So once you kind of get the gist of these, feel free to experiment and turn these on their head, and don't necessarily just use them in traditional ways, which a lot of you might already be very familiar with. So you can see we have 5 different bands. We can turn those all on off here if we want, so we could hear back those changes we've made to each band. Or if we're not using something, I'd almost encourage you to just turn it off, but they're all there. We also have access to our low shelf here, our high pass filters, and then in bands number 2 through 4, we only have access to bell and notch. And then in 5, we have access to our low pass filters and our high shelf filters. Again, the one thing I would really like to see, to be honest, is both a high shelf, or excuse me, a low shelf, and also a high pass filter, like in maybe 2. Unfortunately, they don't give that to you. So if you wanted to do what I think makes the most sense, like let's say for boosting the low end, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to add in this low shelf here. And then what I could do is I could add this EQ2 after the fact. I don't really want all that stuff. So if you have a super hi-fi system, I'm listening in pretty good headphones and I can subtly hear that difference. It's actually giving more weight and more power to the kick drum because we're taking out all of those frequencies that the headphones or that the woofer is trying to reproduce, and it's just going to focus on the actual sound, on the fundamental itself, which the fundamental is up here around 80 or so hertz. And so if I even pull this up a little bit more to emphasize that fundamental in the kick, that loses a bit of power there on the really, really low end in the subs down in that 40 range, but it gives a little bit more power to the kick. And probably what I would do in a situation if I'm trying to make a really strong and powerful kick drum is I would filter this out up to the fundamental, and then I'd add my own layer of sub bass, which would probably just be a sine wave down there in the 40, 50 hertz range, something that would harmonically work well with whatever the fundamental was here, which was something in the, I don't know, 93, 95, 97 range. So just thought I would show you guys that. It can be helpful. But what I want you to do with the EQ-5 and with the EQ2 is play around, see what you can come up with. Try messing around and automating some of these parameters. You can even automate these width controls, which can be a lot of fun and can really change the sound, especially if you're up, like let's say, or down. Like let's say you're down 10 dB. By making an automation move like this, you're actually kind of creating a different filtering sound, and it can be really cool. These are very clean and digital sounding EQs, so you're not going to get any of that character that you would with an analog modeled plugin or with an actual analog EQ, but at the same time, that can be very, very helpful when you need to make clinical changes. And if you want to get more of that analog type sound, you can always use the ladder filter. All right, so that's going to do it for my explanation on the EQ-5. Again, this is meant to be watched in conjunction with the EQ-2. Hope that was helpful for you, and I will catch you again in the next lesson.